Before they tore it down, it had a name. Most of them did. Not a franchise name, not a chain name, a real name, somebody's name. Miss Odell's, Ruby's Place, The Bluebird, Brown's Grill, Calvin's Corner. Names that meant something to the people on that block because they were the names of actual human beings who got up before sunrise every morning and unlocked a door and fired up a stove and decided that they were going to feed their community with everything they had. You probably don't know what I'm talking about if you're under 50, and even if you're over 50, depending on where you grew up, there's a chance you only caught the tail end of it. The last few years before integration changed the landscape and the highway changed the neighborhood. And the family that ran the diner decided they were too tired to fight both of those things at once. But if you know, you know. You know the smell. You know the sound of the screen door slapping shut behind you. You know the way the counter stools were the color of red leather and wobbled just slightly if you sat on the third one from the left. You know the woman behind the counter who called you by your last name because she knew your mama, and your mama's mama, and she knew exactly what you wanted before you opened your mouth. These places were not restaurants in the way the word gets used today. They were not concepts. They were not aesthetics. They were not reviewed in any newspaper or ranked on any list. They were something more important than any of that. They were safe harbor. In a world that told black folks they were not welcome at the counter, these diners built a counter of their own. And what they served at that counter was not just food. It was dignity. It was normalcy. It was the radical act of sitting down and being treated like a human being. Family, today we are going back, all the way back, into the kitchens of pre-integration Black America to recover 25 foods that were served in those diners and are now almost completely forgotten. Some of them you've heard of but never tasted. Some of them you've tasted but couldn't name. And some of them, if your Big Mama was the kind of woman I'm talking about, you had at her table on a Sunday afternoon after she finished her shift. Let's go find them. Hey family, I'm James. And this channel exists for one reason: to make sure we don't lose what our people built before the world decided to look the other way. If you're new here, I need you to do something for me right now. Go hit that subscribe button, ring that bell, because what we do here is remember, and remembering is not something you want to do alone. It is better done in community, better done together. So come on in and join us. Now let's get into it. We are going to move through this history the way the history actually moved, starting in the last years of the segregation era, when these diners were alive and full and at the peak of what they could do, and walking backward, decade by decade, into the older, deeper, more forgotten chapters of black diner culture. Because the further back you go, the more has been buried, and the most buried things are the most worth finding. Number 1. And we are starting in 1962. The year is important. By 1962, the civil rights movement was in the streets, and the sit-in movement had already made the nation's lunch counters into a battleground. Young black men and women were sitting down at white-owned counters across the South and being denied service, being humiliated, being arrested for the crime of wanting a hamburger. You know this history. But here is the part that sometimes gets left out of the telling. While that was happening at the white-owned counters, something else was happening 3 blocks away. 3 blocks away, at a black-owned diner with a hand-painted sign and a menu written on a chalkboard, the kitchen was going full steam. And what they were making in that kitchen, in 1962, in the last real years before the landscape shifted, was something called a smothered pork chop plate. Not a chop you'd recognize from a steakhouse. Not a thin, pale, dry thing on a white plate. This was a bone-in chop. Thick, cut from the shoulder, sometimes 1.5 inches deep, that had been seasoned the night before with salt and black pepper, and a little cayenne that the cook kept in an unlabeled jar and never measured. It went into a cast-iron pan with a thin coat of lard heated until it shimmered, and it stayed there until a brown crust formed on both sides that sealed in every bit of moisture the meat had. Then came the onions, sliced thin, cooked down in the same fat until they were translucent and sweet. Then came a dark gravy built from the drippings, flour, and broth that somebody had made from neck bones the day before. That chop came to the table on an oval plate. always an oval plate, covered in gravy the color of dark mahogany, with a scoop of white rice on the side and 2 pieces of white bread underneath to catch what ran off. The bread was not incidental. The bread was the whole point of the second half of the meal. Child, let me tell you something. You have not eaten until you have eaten bread that has been sitting under a smothered pork chop for 15 minutes. That bread became something else entirely. It became a vessel. It held the gravy and the onion and the memory of the chop and everything that came before it. And in those diners, nobody apologized for it. They put it on the plate on purpose, because nothing was wasted, because everything meant something. Folks don't do this anymore, and that is a shame. Number 2. Still in the early 1960s, and we are talking about a dish that every black diner worth its salt had on the menu on at least 3 days a week, catfish stew. Now I want you to hear the word stew and understand what it does not mean. It does not mean soup. It does not mean something thin and watery in a bowl. Catfish stew in a black diner was thick enough to stand a spoon up in. It was a meal that answered a question before you could finish asking it. The catfish came from wherever the water was nearby. A river, a creek, somebody's cousin who fished on weekends and sold what he caught to the diner owner at a fair price because they were in the same community, and that was just how it was done. The fish was cut into chunks, seasoned hard, and added to a base of tomatoes, corn, and potatoes that had been cooking down for the better part of an hour. Some cooks added a little okra to thicken it further. Some added hot sauce directly into the pot rather than leaving it to the customer. The smell that came off the stove when the lid came up was something that stopped people on the sidewalk outside. It was served with cornbread. Always cornbread. Not a muffin, not a soft sweet thing in a paper wrapper. A wedge of cornbread that had been baked in a cast-iron pan, golden on the outside and just barely set in the middle, with a little bit of crust on the bottom that crackled when you broke it open. You tore that cornbread and you put it in the stew, and you understood something that cannot be put into a word, but can be put into a feeling. That feeling was, I am provided for. That is what those diners gave people. Not just calories, not just food. The feeling that someone had thought about you, that someone had stood at a stove and put care into something and put it in front of you and said, without using words, that you mattered enough to be fed well. Number 3. We are still in the 60s, and we are talking about something that occupied a specific and irreplaceable place on the steam table of every serious black diner, the pig's ear sandwich. If you grew up in a house where nothing was thrown away, you already know what a pig's ear is. If you didn't, let me bring you up to speed. The ear comes from the head of the pig, and it is made of skin and cartilage, and when it is cooked correctly, a layer of gelatinous fat that becomes, in the presence of heat and time, something entirely different from what you might expect. It becomes tender. It becomes yielding. It picks up flavor the way a dry cloth picks up water. In the black diners of the pre-integration South, the ear was cleaned, simmered for hours in seasoned water with onion and bay leaf until it was soft all the way through, then sliced thin enough to read through, if you were of a mind to try, and laid onto white bread that had been spread with a little yellow mustard and whatever hot sauce was on the table, sometimes a few pickle chips, sometimes a ring of raw onion, wrapped in wax paper and sold for 15 cents. 15 cents in 1961. My granddaddy worked 6 days a week and never once complained, and on his lunch break, he would walk 3 blocks from the shop where he worked to a man named Mr. Henderson who ran a counter out of a converted filling station, and he would spend 15 cents on a pig's ear sandwich and 15 cents on a bottle of soda, and that was his lunch, and he ate it standing up on the sidewalk in the sun, and he would tell you, if you asked him, that it was one of the best things he ever ate in his life. That is not nostalgia talking. That is a man who knew what good food was and recognized it when it was in his hand. Number 4. We are moving back now into the late 1950s, and we are picking up something that was on every diner counter, wrapped in cellophane, stacked in a glass case next to the register where you paid, the Crackling biscuit. You know what a biscuit is, but a Crackling biscuit is a specific thing. And if you have never had one, I am genuinely sorry for you. And I mean that kindly. A crackling biscuit is a standard buttermilk biscuit, risen high, pale gold on top, tender and layered inside, into which the cook has folded cracklings. Cracklings are pieces of pork skin that have been rendered until all the fat is gone, and what remains is a crisp, salty, deeply porky bit of something that has no modern equivalent. You fold those cracklings into biscuit dough before you cut it, and what comes out of the oven is something that has layers of flavor going on simultaneously. The rich, barely sweet biscuit, and then inside it, unexpectedly, these little explosions of salt and fat and crunch. Back in those days, these biscuits were made before the sun came up. The cook would arrive at the diner at 4:30 or 5 in the morning, and the first thing she did, before the coffee was started, before the grill was lit, was start the biscuits. Because biscuits take time. And the cracklings were made in-house from pork skin that was a byproduct of the previous day's cooking, rendered down in a heavy pot until they puffed and crisped. Nothing was bought that could be made. Nothing was wasted that could be used. The whole block would smell it on Sunday morning, but honestly, on weekday mornings too. Neighbors would stop and knock before they went to work. The diner owner would sell them a bag of biscuits to take. That was before the front door was even officially open. Number 5. Late 1950s still, and we are talking about a meal that was the reason certain people ate nothing for breakfast on a particular day of the week so they could save their appetite for noon. Oxtail rice. Not oxtail stew, not oxtail soup. Oxtail rice is a specific preparation that existed in black diners primarily in the Carolinas and the Gulf Coast states and has almost entirely vanished from public life. The oxtail, which is exactly what it sounds like, the tail of a beef animal cut into cross-sections, was braised low and slow, usually starting the night before in a heavy covered pot with onion, celery, garlic, and a couple of dried chili peppers. By morning, the collagen in the tail had broken down into the braising liquid and created a sauce with a body unlike anything you have ever bought in a jar. It clung to things. It coated things. It was simultaneously rich and delicate, and it had a depth that came only from time. At lunch service, the oxtail came to the table on a bed of white rice, long grain, cooked until each grain was separate, the way a cook who respects rice cooks rice, and the braising liquid was spooned over the top of everything. The bones were still in. That was intentional. The diner did not take the bones out because there was meat on those bones that you could only reach with your fingers, and in those diners, nobody was going to judge you for using your fingers. You were eating. Eating was the whole point. Child, let me tell you something about oxtail rice. The thing about it was not just the flavor, which was extraordinary. The thing about it was what it meant to see it on the menu. It meant that the cook behind that counter knew how to do something. It meant that somebody back there had patience. It meant that the diner had been open long enough and trusted enough that they could put something on the board that took 18 hours to prepare and know that the people coming through the door would order it. That is a relationship between a cook and a community. That is trust expressed in the form of food. Number 6. We are in the middle 1950s now, and I want to talk about something that sat in a crock on the counter of certain black diners in the deeper South and was not on any written menu because it didn't need to be. Everyone who walked through the door already knew it was there. Pickled pig's feet. A wide-mouthed glass jar, sometimes a ceramic crock, filled with a brine that was vinegar and salt and red pepper flakes and maybe some mustard seed. And in that brine, cured pig's feet that had been cleaned and split and cooked until the skin was soft and yielding and had taken on the sharp, sour, spicy character of everything around it. You bought one for a nickel. You held it in your hand, and you ate it standing at the counter. There was no plate. There was no fork. There was wax paper to hold it, and that was all. The feet were gelatinous and tender and absolutely polarizing. The people who loved them with a fierceness that had nothing to do with hunger and everything to do with identity. These were a black food. They were a southern food. They were a poor food that had been transformed by generations of skill into something that made people drive across town. Now, Big Mama, she used to say that the best judge of a cook was not what they could do with a nice piece of meat. Anybody could cook a nice piece of meat. The real test, she said, was what they could do with what everybody else threw away. And those pickled pig's feet were the proof of that principle in its purest form. You won't see that today. Not in any establishment that is trying to appear respectable to the wider world. And that is a loss that is bigger than the food itself. It is a loss of the philosophy that made the food. The philosophy that said, we will not be defined by our constraints. We will be defined by what we make of them. Now, before we go any further, family, I want to stop for just a second and ask you something directly. And I want you to answer in the comments, because this one matters to me. Was there a black-owned diner, a lunch counter, a cafe, a carryout, or a grill in your neighborhood when you were coming up? I don't care if it was a big place or a small place, a famous place, or just a place your family knew. I want to know the name of it, and I want to know what you ordered when you walked through that door. Drop it in the comments right now. Tell me the name, tell me the food, and tell me whose hands made it. Because those places deserve to be remembered by name. Too many of them are already forgotten, and I am not willing to let that happen quietly. So put it in the comments. I read every single one. Now let's keep going. Number 7. We are traveling further back, into the early 1950s now, and we are picking up a dish that was a staple of black diners in the Mississippi Delta and the Alabama Black Belt, and barely exists anywhere anymore. Hogmaw and turnip greens. Hogmaw is the stomach of a pig. Clean that up, washed thoroughly, boiled in seasoned water. And what you have is something with a firm, almost chewy texture that absorbs flavor completely. The way it was prepared in those Delta diners was to slice it after the initial boiling, then put it in a pot with turnip greens that had been cooking for hours with smoked fatback, black pepper, and a pinch of sugar to cut the bitterness. The hogmaw and the greens became indistinguishable from each other in terms of flavor. They spoke the same language. They had been cooked in the same liquid long enough that they understood each other. It came to the table in a deep bowl because it had pot liquor, that dark, deeply flavored liquid that collected at the bottom of the greens pot and was considered by every serious cook to be the most valuable thing in the building. Some people drank the pot liquor straight. Some people sopped it with cornbread. Some people poured it over everything. The right answer is all three, sequentially, in whatever order you needed. Back in those days, a bowl of hogmaw and turnip greens in a Delta diner in 1951 cost you 30 cents. And that 30 cents included the cornbread. And the person who brought it to you probably called you by your first name because she had known you since before you could walk. That was just how it was done. Number 8. Staying in the early 50s, going deeper into the fabric of those diner kitchens, and we are talking now about something that is so far outside of what modern food culture recognizes that I want to spend some real time with it. Chitterlings hash. You know what chitterlings are, or you know the word. The small intestines of a pig cleaned, and the cleaning was a project unto itself, a multi-day process that happened in the fall when hog-killing season came, that required several people and serious intention and a smell that you either made your peace with or you didn't. The women who made the best chitterlings in any given community were known by name. Their chitterlings were sought out. People came to get them specifically. But chitterlings hash is a different preparation than the stewed chitterlings that most people know. Hash, in the diner tradition, meant the chitterlings were chopped fine after cooking, then combined with potatoes that had been diced and fried until golden, with onion and bell pepper and black pepper and a little vinegar for brightness. All of it cooked together in a heavy skillet until everything was crisp on the outside and tender inside. It was served as a breakfast item in most diners, alongside eggs scrambled soft and a cup of coffee that had been on the burner since 4 in the morning and had opinions about it. Chitterlings hash was a Saturday morning food in many of those diners. It was the food you ate after you had been up early, after you had done your first set of errands, after you had walked past the diner and the smell had reached out and taken you by the collar and suggested strongly that you come inside. It was unapologetically itself. It did not try to be anything else. and the people who ate it were unapologetically themselves, sitting at that counter in their work clothes on a Saturday morning, not performing anything for anyone, just eating what they had always eaten because it was good and it was theirs. Number 9. We are going back further now, into the late 1940s. The war is over. Men are coming home. And in the black communities of the South, something is happening. The diner scene is growing. Men came back from Europe and the Pacific having seen a wider world, and they were not willing to be put back in the same small box they had been handed before they left. Some of them opened businesses. Some of them opened diners. And in those diners, in the late 1940s, you could find something called neckbone soup on the lunch board every single day. Neckbones are exactly what the name says, the bony, irregular cuts from the neck of a pig, which have very little meat on them individually, but when cooked long enough in water with vegetables and seasoning, release everything they have into the broth. The collagen, the marrow, the deep, piggy flavor that makes a broth rich enough to coat the back of a spoon. In those late 40s diners, neckbone soup was the backbone, and I mean that in every sense, of the midweek menu. It was the dish that got made on Monday from Sunday's extra pork, that simmered all morning, that was ready by 11 and sold out by 1. It was served in a heavy bowl with whatever vegetable the cook had that week, sometimes cabbage, sometimes sweet potato, sometimes both, and a piece of cornbread on the side that you were expected to crumble directly into the soup if you knew what you were doing. Now, child, I want you to understand something about neckbone soup that goes beyond the recipe. Neckbone soup was a food of radical efficiency and radical care at the same time. Every piece of that animal that could feed a person was used to feed a person. Not one thing was wasted. And in those post-war diner kitchens where margins were thin and communities were still navigating a world that was hostile to their very existence, that efficiency was not just practical. It was a form of dignity. We do not throw things away. We find the value in what we have. We feed people with what we have. That was the philosophy. And the neckbone soup was the proof. Number 10. Mid to late 1940s, and we are picking up something that was served in a very specific kind of black diner, the kind that catered to the men who worked on the railroads, the dock workers, the men who did the heavy labor that kept southern cities moving and were never thanked for it in any way that mattered. These diners opened early and served big food because the men coming in at 5:30 in the morning before a long day needed something that would last until well past noon, and what many of them ordered was a sweet potato and pork breakfast plate. Roasted sweet potato, not candied, not sweetened, just roasted in the oven until the skin blistered and the inside was soft and concentrated, its natural sugar caramelized inside. Served alongside thick-cut pork ribs that had been cooked the previous day and reheated on the flat-top grill, and a couple of eggs scrambled hard the way working men asked for them, because soft eggs were for people who had time to be delicate, and these men did not have time for that. The sweet potato was served in its skin. You split it open yourself. There was a small dish of butter, not margarine, butter, and you added it yourself, and it melted into the orange flesh and ran down the sides and pooled on the plate, and that was breakfast. That was 4:30 in the morning, dark outside, the diner lit up from the inside like the only warm place in the world, and a woman behind the counter who had been there since 3:30 and would be there until 2 in the afternoon, and who handed you that plate without ceremony, without performance, just as the most natural thing in the world. We didn't have much, but we had everything that mattered. Number 11. We are going back further, into the early 1940s. The war has not ended yet. Rationing is in effect. And in the black-owned diners of America, creativity is not optional, it is required. The federal government has restricted access to sugar, butter, meat, and canned goods. And a diner cook in 1943, who is feeding her community, has to figure out how to do it with what is left. What a lot of them figured out was souse meat, sometimes called head cheese, and it was on diner menus across the South and the Midwest in the war years and for a decade after. Souse is made from the parts of a pig that most people don't want to think about too hard. The head, the feet, the ears, sometimes the tongue. Everything gets cleaned thoroughly and simmered until the meat falls from the bones. The bones are removed. The meat is shredded fine, packed into a loaf pan with the cooking liquid, which is rich with gelatin from all that connective tissue, seasoned with vinegar and black pepper and sometimes crushed red pepper, and then refrigerated until the gelatin sets and you have something you can slice. It is served cold, on a plate, with crackers and mustard, and it is unlike anything else that has ever existed in the world of food. Now, Big Mama, she used to say that Souse was the dish that revealed who you were. Not who you presented yourself as and who you actually were. Because Souse required patience. It required full use of everything. It required the willingness to do the unglamorous work of taking something that nobody else wanted and turning it, through effort and knowledge and time, into something that people sought out specifically. That was the black diner tradition in its purest form, and Souse was the emblem of it. Number 12. We are in the late 1930s now. The Depression is still fresh in the memory of anyone over 30, and the diners that existed in black communities in the late 1930s were not operating on excess. They were operating on necessity. And one of the dishes that necessity produced, and that stayed on menus for the next 3 decades because it was too good to let go, was fried saltfish with grits. Saltfish, not fresh fish. Fish that had been cured in salt to preserve it because refrigeration was not universal and people needed protein that lasted. The fish came in a wooden box packed in coarse salt and had to be soaked overnight in cold water, with the water changed several times, to draw the salt back out and bring the fish back toward edibility. The result was fish that was firm, intensely flavored, almost smoky from the curing process, and unlike fresh fish in almost every way. In those diner kitchens, the soaked saltfish was patted dry, dusted in a little flour or cornmeal, and fried in a cast-iron pan with lard until it crisped at the edges. It came to the table with a plate of grits, not quick grits, stone-ground grits that had been cooked for 45 minutes in a double boiler, thick and smooth and with a little fat stirred in at the end, and a cup of black coffee. That plate, in a black diner in Birmingham or Atlanta or rural Mississippi in 1938, was the kind of breakfast that carried a man through a full morning of labor and into the afternoon. It was serious food for serious work. And the hands that made it understood both the labor and the people who performed it because they were the same community. The cook and the customer and the laborer and the neighbor were all the same people. The diner was not a business that existed apart from the community. It was the community, concentrated in a building, feeding itself. Number 13. Deep into the Depression years now, the early to mid-1930s, and we are in the territory of food that was born of absolute necessity and became something transcendent despite that, or maybe because of it. This is the era of crackling cornbread, and I want to give it its full due. We talked about crackling biscuits earlier, but crackling cornbread is different in its character and its history. This was made in a cast-iron skillet, always cast iron, because that was what the kitchen had, with stone-ground cornmeal, buttermilk, an egg if you had one, a little salt, and cracklings. Pork skin that had been rendered of its fat, those small, irregular, crisp pieces folded directly into the batter. The skillet was greased with lard and put in the oven first, so it was already screaming hot when the batter went in. That hot skillet hit the cold batter and immediately sealed the bottom into a crust, dark, crisp, almost crackling itself. What came out was a round of cornbread, with a texture that was different from anything you could achieve by other means. It was dense and moist in the center, with that crust on the bottom that snapped when you broke it, and all through it these little pockets of cracklings that had gone soft in the heat of the oven while retaining their salt and their pork character. It was, by any reasonable measure, one of the great achievements of American cooking. It required almost no ingredients. It produced something profound. Those diners in the 30s had it on the menu because it was what the cook could make and still keep the lights on. And the people who ate it were grateful not out of politeness but out of genuine recognition. This was something worth eating. This was not deprivation food dressed up. This was skill expressed in its most essential form. That was just how it was done. Number 14. We are still in the Depression, in the middle 1930s. and we are talking about a dish that requires a bit of explanation before we can properly appreciate it. Liver pudding. Not liver and onions, which has a broader audience. Not liverwurst, which was a different tradition from a different European immigrant community. Liver pudding was a specifically southern black preparation that combined ground or finely chopped pork liver with cornmeal, onion, sage, black pepper, and just enough pork fat to hold it together, packed into a cloth casing or a loaf pan and cooked until it was firm. It was then sliced and either eaten cold or fried in a skillet until crisp on both sides. Liver has a flavor that is assertive. You cannot hide it. Any cook who worked with liver in those diner kitchens understood this and leaned into it rather than fighting it. The sage was not incidental. Sage is one of the only herbs strong enough to stand in the same ring with liver and come out equal. The cornmeal gave the pudding texture and body. The pepper gave it a low, steady heat that ran through every bite. Fried liver pudding on a plate in a black diner in 1934, with a side of cooked cabbage and a piece of cornbread, was not a compromise. It was a meal designed by people who understood both their ingredients and their community. It was what was available, and it was made with the same intention and the same care as any dish that cost 3 times as much and required twice the ingredients. Back in those days, there was no hierarchy of ingredients. There was only the question of what you knew how to do with what you had. Number 15. We are in the late 1920s now, at the beginning of our journey backward, at the deepest layer of this history, and what we find there is not simple. The late 1920s were the tail end of a particular kind of black community prosperity that would be devastated by the depression that was about to arrive. In cities like Durham and Tulsa and Richmond and Chicago, black-owned business districts were thriving. Black diners in those districts were serving customers who had money, who expected quality, and who got it. And one of the dishes they got, in the finest black diners of the late 1920s, was a fried chicken liver plate that was nothing like what you might be imagining. These were chicken livers, small, dark, tender, that had been soaked in buttermilk, then dredged in well-seasoned flour, salt, black pepper, a little paprika, cayenne, garlic powder. Fried in clean, hot lard until the coating was dry and crisp, and the liver inside was cooked just to the point of doneness, still with a little pink in the center, still tender enough to cut with a fork. Served on a platter with red-eye gravy, made from ham drippings and black coffee, a southern gravy that is simultaneously strange and correct, and a mound of white rice. The red-eye gravy is the key to understanding why this dish worked. It is not a conventional gravy. It is thin. It is slightly bitter from the coffee. It has a dark, smoky depth from the ham drippings. It cuts through the richness of the liver in a way that no cream gravy could, because cream would have competed and the red-eye gravy collaborated. Together, they were something neither was alone. In those prosperous black diners of the late 1920s, before the banks failed and the bottom fell out and everything changed, this was a dish on a real menu in a real dining room with real tablecloths. And the people who ate it understood that they were eating well. They knew it. They had built something. They were eating inside it. Number 16. The late 1920s. And we are picking up something that came from the domestic workers, the household staff, the women who spent their days in the kitchens of white families, and who, on their days off and in their own communities, cooked what they actually wanted to eat. One of the things they wanted to eat was pot roast hash, and the version that showed up in black diners was different from what the families they worked for served at Sunday supper. In white households of that era, pot roast was a formal preparation. A large cut, cooked whole, served with the vegetables arranged around it, the gravy served separately in a boat. In black diners, the leftovers of that same basic idea became something better. The cooked meat was shredded or diced fine, combined with diced potatoes and onion and whatever other vegetable was present, and fried on a flat top or a skillet with enough fat to crisp the outside of everything while keeping the inside moist, seasoned heavily, cooked until it held together enough to be cut into a wedge and placed on a plate. This hash was not a lesser version of the original dish. It was a transformation. It was what happens when someone with real skill and real knowledge takes a raw material and uses it to produce something that the original could not have predicted. That is what black diner cooks did, and did it so consistently that it became a tradition. Number 17.
We are at the deeper foundation now in the mid-1920s, and we are talking about something that requires a specific kind of cultural context to understand properly. Baked sweet potato pudding.
Not pie, pudding. The distinction matters because the preparation is different and the result is different. Sweet potato pudding in the diner tradition was made by grating raw sweet potato on a box grater, a laborious process done by hand, filling a bowl with orange shreds and combining it with eggs, milk, butter, a little sugar, spices, ginger, nutmeg, sometimes a trace of clove. This mixture was poured into a buttered pan and baked low and slow until it set into something firm but yielding, with a dark, almost caramelized top and a texture that was denser than a custard and less starchy than a pie. It was served in squares, at room temperature, sometimes with a spoonful of cream if the diner had it. It was a dessert, but not only a dessert. In those mid-20s diners, it was sometimes served at midday as part of a plate, because the line between sweet and savory was not as rigidly policed as it has become. A square of sweet potato pudding next to a bowl of neck bones and rice made a complete and balanced meal by the nutritional understanding of that era and by the practical experience of the people eating it. This right here, this is something we need to bring back, not just as a recipe, as a philosophy. The philosophy that dessert is not a separate category from nutrition, that something can be sweet and also sustaining, that a cook's job is to feed the whole person, not just to satisfy a craving. Number 18. Still in the 1920s, and we are talking about a dish that traveled with the Great Migration, that massive movement of black Southerners northward into Chicago, Detroit, Cleveland, Pittsburgh, New York, and that existed in black diners in both the South and the northern cities simultaneously, with variations that told you exactly which version of the migration story you were in. The dish is buttermilk pie, and in the diner context, it was not what most people today would recognize. In the South, buttermilk pie was a simple, clear-flavored thing. Eggs, buttermilk, butter, sugar, a little flour to give it body, a little nutmeg or vanilla for seasoning. Poured into a plain pastry shell and baked until just set, with a slight wobble in the center that told the cook it was done. The filling was custardy, but not rich in the way of a cream pie. It had a clean, faintly sour edge from the buttermilk that cut through the sweetness, and made it a thing you could eat a slice of and then consider eating another. In the northern diners, in Chicago's Bronzeville, in Detroit's Black Bottom, it got additions. Sometimes lemon zest, sometimes a vanilla bean instead of extract. The crust got a little more attention. Not because the southern version was inferior, but because the northern cooks were working with a slightly wider pantry and wanted to show what they could do with it. Both versions ended up in the glass case next to the register, sold by the slice. And family, I want you to know, a slice of cold buttermilk pie from a black-owned diner in 1924 was one of the finest things you could put in your mouth. The kind of thing that was simple enough that there was nowhere to hide and a skilled cook made it shine, and a lazy cook could not fake. Number 19. We are going into the early 1920s now, and the diners of this era were not called diners. They were called eating places, lunchrooms, cookshops. The terminology was different because the form was still being invented, but the function was exactly the same. Feed the community every day, well, at a price that the community could afford. In those eating places of the early 20s, one of the foundational dishes of the menu was fried green tomatoes with pot liquor gravy. Fried green tomatoes have become, since a movie made them famous to a wider audience in the early 1990s, something of a southern shorthand. But the version in those early black eating places was specific in a way that the popular understanding misses. The tomatoes were green, underripe, firm, with a sharp acidity that was the whole point. They were sliced thick, dredged in cornmeal seasoned with salt and black pepper, fried in lard in a cast-iron skillet until the crust was deep gold and the tomato inside had softened just enough. That part most people know. The pot liquor gravy is the part that has been lost. Pot liquor, the cooking liquid from a long pot of greens, dark and saline and profoundly flavored, was thickened with a little flour and poured over the fried tomatoes on the plate. What happened at that intersection was something that required a moment of appreciation before you ate it. The crisp acidity of the tomato crust, the dark, almost mineral depth of the pot liquor gravy, the cornmeal exterior absorbing that gravy and becoming something between crisp and tender. It was a dish that used everything, that wasted nothing, that produced, from 4 ingredients that cost almost nothing, something genuinely complex. Back in those days, knowing how to make that gravy was a point of pride. Some cooks kept their greens pot going all week, adding and reducing, until by Friday the pot liquor in the bottom of that pot was so concentrated it was almost a stock. That was the one they used for the gravy. That was the one that made people ask where it came from. Number 20. We are in the mid-1910s now, far back, deeper than most living memory reaches. And the food culture we are describing was not yet codified into any form that restaurant scholars or food historians paid attention to. But it was alive. It was vibrant. It was feeding people every day in the cookshops and eating houses and boarding house tables of black communities across the South. And one of the things it was serving was fish roe cakes. Fish roe, the egg sacs from any fish available locally, often shad or mullet or river perch, was a seasonal abundance in late winter and early spring when the fish were running, and the cookshops of that era took advantage of it. The roe was mixed with cornmeal, a beaten egg, salt, black pepper, and a little onion grated fine, formed into small flat cakes, and fried in a skillet until golden on both sides. The result was something that was simultaneously delicate and rich, with a flavor that was intensely marine and a texture that was crisp outside and custardy within. Fish roe cakes were a breakfast item in most of those early cookshops, served alongside scrambled eggs and grits on a plate that cost a dime in 1915. They were a seasonal treat, available only when the fish were running, and their appearance on the menu was an event. People came for them specifically. The season was short, the window closed, and then you waited another year. Now, Big Mama, she used to say that some things being scarce made them more precious, and that the anticipation was part of the pleasure. That was a woman who had lived long enough to understand that abundance dulls the sense of value. And those fish roe cakes, arriving once a year in the early spring, were the proof of what she meant. Number 21. We are in the early 1910s, deeper than any living memory can directly reach, but not out of range of what grandmothers told their granddaughters and great-grandmothers told their grandchildren. And what I want to tell you about is a preparation that existed in those early 20th century cookshops that nobody is making anymore. Dried bean soup with ham hock and sweet potato. Bean soup is not an unusual thing, but this specific combination, navy beans or field peas soaked overnight and simmered long with a smoked ham hock, then joined partway through cooking by diced sweet potato, produced something that has never been fully duplicated in any restaurant kitchen I am aware of. The beans gave the broth starch and body. The ham hock gave it smoke and salt, and the kind of deep pork flavor that takes hours to develop and cannot be rushed. And the sweet potato, added in the last hour, did something unexpected. It broke down slightly at the edges and stirred into the broth, adding a natural sweetness that balanced the salt and smoke and made the whole bowl round in a way that no single one of those ingredients could have achieved alone. In the cookshops and eating houses of the Black South in 1912, this soup on the midday board meant that somebody had been up since before dawn and thinking ahead. It meant planning. It meant knowledge passed from one cook to another about how to make dried beans into something that fed people's bodies and their spirits simultaneously. That kind of cooking is a form of love. There is no other word for it that is accurate. Number 22. Still in the early 1910s, and we are at the edge of the era that directly followed the end of Reconstruction, when black communities in the South were navigating a world of increasing legal restriction and violence, and were building parallel economies with whatever they could hold on to. One of the things they built was a food economy. And in that food economy, one of the most important items was a dish called crackling bread soup, which is exactly what it sounds like, and also something far beyond what it sounds like. The bread itself was the crackling cornbread we described earlier, dense, pork-rich, crumbling. But in this preparation, old bread from the previous day or the day before that, was the base. It was broken into a bowl and covered with pot liquor, the greens liquid again, and sometimes with a ladle of the broth from whatever had been cooking on the stove. The cracklings in the bread softened slightly in the liquid, releasing their remaining fat into the bowl. The cornmeal, having fully absorbed the pot liquor, became something almost porridge-like in texture but entirely savory in character. This is a dish of absolute humility and absolute genius. It looks like leftovers. It looks like survival. And it was both of those things and also neither of those things, because the people who made it and the people who ate it were not thinking about surviving. They were thinking about eating well. They were thinking about not wasting. They were thinking about making the next meal from what the last meal left behind. And in that thinking, that entirely practical, non-romantic daily thinking, they produced something that no one who has never eaten it can fully understand from a description alone. Child, let me tell you something. The deepest wisdom of black food culture is not in the fancy preparations. It is in the ones that look like nothing and taste like everything. Number 23. We have arrived in the late 1800s, the late 1890s, and we are at the foundational level of this history. The cookshops and eating places that would eventually become the diners we have been describing were just forming. And the woman behind the pot in those establishments was cooking food that had roots going back through slavery, back through Africa, back through a history of forced migration and cultural survival that produced, in the kitchen, one of the most remarkable culinary traditions on the planet. In those 1890s cookshops, there was a dish called ash cake, and it is so ancient in its origins and so forgotten in its current form that I want to give it the full weight of what it deserves. Ash cake was cornmeal, just cornmeal, salt, and water mixed into a dough, shaped into a flat cake, and placed directly in the coals and ash of an open fire to bake, not in a pan, not in an oven. In the ash, covered with coals, cooked by radiant heat until the outside formed a hard grey crust that you broke off and discarded and found inside a bread that was dense and moist and flavoured, faintly, by the smoke of whatever wood had been burning. In the 1890s, cookshops, ash cake was a side item, a carryover from a much older tradition, sold to people who remembered what it tasted like and asked for it by name. It was not on a printed menu. It was known. It was understood. It was made by cooks who had learned it from women who had never had access to ovens, and who had taken the most basic of all foods, grain, water, salt, and made it into bread using nothing more than fire and knowledge. That lineage is worth more than I can say here in the time we have. Every piece of bread baked in every black diner from 1900 to 1970 had the ash cake somewhere back in its ancestry. The woman at the stove in 1962 making crackling cornbread in a cast-iron skillet was the granddaughter of a woman who knew how to bake bread in ash. The line did not break. It only changed form. Number 24. We are near the end of our journey back, and I want to talk about a dish that connects everything we have discussed, that sits at the intersection of survival and celebration, of African culinary knowledge and American necessity, of the old world and the new. That dish is jerk pork, and I am not talking about the Jamaican version, though they share a common ancestor. I am talking about the American Southern version that existed in black cookshops and early diners in the late 1800s and early 1900s. Pork was marinated in a combination of vinegar, black pepper, dried red pepper, a little sugar, and whatever aromatic the cook had access to, sometimes sassafras, sometimes dried herbs from the kitchen garden, and then cooked low and slow over smoldering wood coals until it could be pulled apart with 2 forks. This was not barbecue in the modern sense of the word. This predated the barbecue culture we know. This was older. This was pork cooked by people who understood how to make fire do slow, patient work. The result was pulled pork, before pulled pork was a restaurant concept. served on a piece of cornbread or a slice of white bread, with a spoonful of the cooking liquid and a dish of pickled vegetables on the side. This was a meal that required nothing else and asked for nothing more. It was complete. It was, in its completeness, a statement about the capabilities of the people who made it, capabilities that the wider world consistently underestimated and that the food consistently proved. Number 25. We have come to the end of our list. And I have saved this one for last because it is not a single dish. It is a practice, a ritual, a thing that happened in those diners that is so far outside the world we live in now that I need to take a moment before I describe it. In the black eating houses and cookshops of the late 1800s and the early 1900s, and into the first decades of the 20th century, there was a practice called the community pot. The community pot was exactly what the name says. A large pot, the largest pot in the kitchen, in which the cook would put everything that was available and could not be used for anything else. The end of the neck bones, the liquid from the beans, the last of the sweet potato, a heel of cornbread broken into pieces, sometimes a small amount of saltfish, sometimes a handful of dried peas, sometimes nothing more than water and seasoning and whatever the stove had to offer. It was not soup, exactly. It was not stew, exactly. It was a meal that had no fixed recipe and a different character every time it was made. And in those early eating houses, it was offered to people who could not pay. To the man who had been out of work for 3 weeks. To the family that had just arrived from somewhere else. To the child who came in alone and stood near the door looking uncertain. The cook would ladle it into a bowl and put it in front of them without asking questions and without calling attention to the transaction. It was just done. It was just how the kitchen worked. And nobody who needed it was made to feel that they were receiving charity, because the bowl looked the same as everyone else's bowl, and the spoon was the same spoon, and nobody was going to announce what was happening to the rest of the room. That is the thing I want you to take away from this video today. Not just the recipes, not just the list, but the philosophy that lived behind every item on this list, that was present in every one of those diner kitchens, that showed up in the community pot and the crackling bread and the pig's ear sandwich and the oxtail rice and all the way back to the ash cake in the coals. The philosophy that said, everyone who comes through this door will be fed. Everyone will be treated as if they matter. No one will leave hungry if we can help it. And we will do this not because someone told us to, not because it was profitable, but because this is what a community does for itself. This is what we are. Family. Those diners are mostly gone now. Most of the buildings have been torn down or converted. Most of the cooks have passed on. Most of the recipes were never written down. But the philosophy is not gone. Not yet. Because we are here right now, together remembering it. And as long as we remember it, it has not fully left us. That is why we do this. Not for nostalgia. Not to look backward and feel sad, but to look backward and understand what we were capable of, so that we can carry some part of that forward. I'll see you next time, family.